She was just a humble house cleaner, moving quietly from one home to the next, never expecting anything more than an honest day's work. But one client, one house, and one mysterious gift would change her life forever, leading her into a story filled with secrets, second chances, and a legacy she never saw coming. This is a story about fate, kindness, and the unbelievable surprise that waited at the end of a mop and bucket. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, let us know where you're watching from by dropping a comment below. We love seeing our listeners from all over the world come together for these powerful stories. Now let's begin. Evelyn Carter had scrubbed more floors than she could count, polished more brass than most folks even owned, and folded more laundry than a small-town laundromat might see in a month. At 63, her back ached when she stood too long, and her knees creaked when she climbed stairs. But her hands, those strong, worn hands, never stopped working. They were the kind of hands that had raised 3 children after her husband, passed in '94, the kind that held sorrow and survival in equal measure. She didn't mind the labor. In fact, in many ways, she found comfort in it. The routine of cleaning gave her peace. Order in a world that hadn't offered her much of it. Her days began at sunrise, with the soft whistle of the kettle and the gentle hum of a gospel station on the radio. She packed a small lunch, slipped on her pale blue uniform, and headed out, in her old but faithful Ford Taurus. Most of her clients were upper-middle-class families scattered across Charleston's winding, tree-lined streets. Young professionals too busy to pick up after themselves, elderly couples who liked things done just so, and the occasional family who treated her like a fixture rather than a person. Evelyn had learned long ago not to take it personally, so when she received a referral to clean the Whitmore estate, she didn't think much of it. "Big place," the agency coordinator told her. "Old money. The gentleman's lived there forever. Quiet type, but polite." Evelyn jotted down the address and tucked the paper into her worn leather purse. She'd passed by the mansion before, a gray stone behemoth tucked behind iron gates, its windows shaded by ivy and thyme. She never thought she'd step inside. The morning she first drove through those gates, the world felt heavy with humidity. Spanish moss dripped from the oak trees like lace curtains, and the gravel crunched beneath her tires in a way that reminded her of the drive to her grandmother's farm decades ago. She parked beside the stone steps and studied the front door. It was tall and arched, with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. Before she could lift her hand to knock, the door creaked open. A man stood there, tall, gaunt, and pale, with snow-white hair combed back from a weathered forehead. He wore a beige sweater despite the heat, his slacks neatly pressed. His eyes were a piercing gray, cool, observant, like he'd seen far more than he let on. "You know, must be Evelyn," he said, his voice gravelly but steady. "Yes, sir," she replied with a polite smile. "Come in." The interior of the house was dim, but elegant. The air smelled faintly of old books and lemon polish. The foyer opened into a grand hall with a winding staircase, its banister carved with ivy patterns. A chandelier hung above, its crystals catching, just enough light to glimmer like distant stars. "You'll find cleaning supplies in the closet off the kitchen." "I don't like much noise and I don't need company," he said, turning away before she could respond. "You may start wherever you'd like. I'll be in the library." He walked with a cane, though he moved with surprising agility. She watched him disappear down a hallway lined with portraits, men and women in formal poses, all with the same cold elegance as her new employer. She set down her bag, took a deep breath, and began in the front sitting room. The dust was thick, like no one had touched the place in years. Magazines from the early 2000s sat in a neat pile on the coffee table. The curtains were heavy brocade, drawn tight against the sunlight. She tugged them open, letting the light pour in. Dust motes danced in the golden beams. The room seemed to exhale, as though it had been holding its breath for too long. She worked quietly, as always. Her hands moved with practiced ease, vacuuming rugs, wiping baseboards, polishing end tables. Still, she couldn't help but notice the peculiar silence of the place. No televisions blared, no phones rang, no ticking clocks. Even the air conditioning whispered like it feared waking ghosts. Later, while wiping down the dining room's ornate sideboard, she caught a glimpse of a photo tucked behind a candlestick. A young woman in a ballet costume stood beside a man who looked very much like Mr. Whitmore, only younger, fuller, smiling. The girl had his sharp jawline, but her eyes were soft, full of light. Evelyn didn't stare long. She knew better than to pry. By the time she finished for the day, the house looked a little brighter, a little less forgotten. As she gathered her things, Mr. Whitmore appeared at the bottom of the staircase. "You come back Wednesday," he said, not as a question, but a statement. "Yes, sir." "Same time?" He nodded. "The same." Then, after a pause, added, "You did good work." It was the first compliment she'd received in a long while. Evelyn stepped out into the late afternoon sun, the mansion behind her seeming somehow smaller than when she'd arrived. As she drove away, she glanced once in the rearview mirror and caught sight of Mr. Whitmore at the window, his hand resting on the sill, watching her leave. She didn't know it yet, but this house, this man, was about to change her life in ways she could never have imagined. When Evelyn returned the following Wednesday, the sky was overcast, and the mansion looked even more somber than before. The stone walls, once stoic, now seemed burdened by time, their edges softened by creeping ivy and years of silence. The front door groaned open just as she reached the top step, as if the house had been holding its breath since she left. Mr. Whitmore was not in the foyer this time. Instead, a quiet stillness greeted her, as though the house had awakened slowly and cautiously to her presence. She stepped inside, set her bag down in the usual spot near the coat rack, and started her day without a word exchanged. She moved through the house with measured steps, dusting the ornate moldings in the sitting room, straightening antique books in the den, carefully polishing the woodwork that ran like veins through the old bones of the mansion. But even as her hands stayed busy, her eyes wandered. There was something about the air in the Whitmore estate, thick, quiet, expectant. Every corridor seemed to hum with stories long forgotten. Every painting watched her. Every creak in the floorboard whispered of memories that hadn't been spoken aloud in decades. In the dining room, she paused before a large oil painting of a woman seated by a window. Her hair was pinned high, her dress ivory silk. The artist had captured a kind of wistfulness in her gaze, a gaze that seemed to follow Evelyn as she moved. She looked nothing like the young ballerina in the photo from last week, but there was a resemblance in the way her eyes searched the light. Evelyn had learned not to ask questions in other people's homes, but this house, unlike the others she'd cleaned, seemed almost to invite her curiosity. By mid-morning, she had worked her way to the hallway just beyond the library. The corridor was long and lined with photographs, sepia-toned snapshots of men in military uniforms, women at garden parties, children on ponies. There was a quiet dignity to each frame, but also a strange absence. None of the pictures were recent. It was as if time had stopped somewhere in the late 1980s and refused to move forward. At the far end of the hall stood a door, taller than the others, with a polished brass knob that gleamed like it had been recently touched. Evelyn had passed dozens of doors in her years of cleaning, but this one gave her pause. It wasn't just locked. It felt sealed, like a memory too painful to let breathe. She stood there a moment, listening. No sound came from the other side, just the weight of something unresolved. She turned to walk away, but as she did, she noticed Mr. Whitmore standing at the library entrance, watching her. His eyes were unreadable, his expression neither welcoming nor unkind. "That room's not ready yet," he said quietly, as if the words carried more than their literal meaning. "Yes, sir," Evelyn replied, lowering her gaze and moving on. Rest of the day passed in silence. Mr. Whitmore remained in the library, surrounded by shelves stacked with volumes of forgotten knowledge, leather-bound journals, encyclopedias, and books with gold-lettered spines. Occasionally, Evelyn would hear the soft turning of a page or the faint clink of a teacup on porcelain. Though they barely spoke, she felt his presence, always nearby, always watchful. But there was no malice in it. Just a kind of quiet loneliness, that settled into the corners of the house like old dust. Later, while cleaning the upstairs guest room, Evelyn noticed a music box on the nightstand. Its surface was chipped, its lacquer faded, but the tiny ballerina on top still spun beneath a cracked glass dome. She wound it gently, and a delicate melody filled the air, soft, wistful, almost sorrowful. She let it play for a few seconds, before stopping it. The silence afterward felt deeper, as if the song had stirred something buried. As she packed her supplies that afternoon, Mr. Whitmore appeared at the top of the stairs. He looked tired, the lines in his face more pronounced, under the hallway chandelier. "Did you find everything you needed today?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. "I did, thank you," she replied. "It's a beautiful home, sir." He nodded, then looked toward the end of the hall, the door she'd paused at earlier. "Some rooms hold more than dust," he said, more to himself than to her. "Some hold the weight of decisions made too late." Evelyn wasn't sure how to respond, so she offered a gentle, "If you ever need help with them, I'm here." His eyes met hers, surprised at first, then softening with a trace of something like gratitude. He nodded again, and with that, turned and disappeared into his room. Driving home that day, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something deeper than dusting and vacuuming. The house wasn't just a building, it was a memory in stone. And Mr. Whitmore, for all his quiet reserve, was a man wrapped in shadows, holding on to something he hadn't yet dared to let go. She didn't know yet what secrets the Whitmore mansion held, but she had a feeling they would find their way to her, one whispered memory at a time. The third time Evelyn came to the Whitmore estate, there was a different feeling in the air. The sky had cleared from its usual gray, letting sunlight dapple across the gravel drive, and even the ivy along the walls seemed less weighed down by time. As she stepped out of her car and made her way to the front door, she noticed the faint scent of jasmine in the breeze, a delicate, almost imperceptible perfume that reminded her of spring days long gone. The door opened before she could knock, as it always seemed to, and Mr. Whitmore stood there, not just waiting, but looking as if he had something to say. He stepped aside and gestured her in, his cane tapping softly against the wooden floor as he led her to the kitchen. Evelyn followed, uncertain of the change in routine. "Would you care for some tea before you begin?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder with a look she hadn't seen before, half invitation, half vulnerability. Evelyn hesitated. Clients rarely offered her anything beyond a thank you and her payment. But something in his tone, something in the quiet earnestness of the question, made her nod. "Yes, thank you. That would be lovely." The kitchen, to her surprise, was warm and homey. Unlike the grand rooms filled with antiques and museum-like silence, this space had life in it. Copper pans hung from a rack above the stove, and a kettle steamed gently on the burner. The wallpaper was faded but cheerful, covered in delicate blue flowers that reminded Evelyn of her mother's old apron. Mr. Whitmore moved slowly but surely, preparing 2 cups and setting them on the small table by the window. They sat down, across from each other, the light spilling in like golden silk. "I imagine you've worked in many homes," he said, stirring his tea with a slender silver spoon, "but perhaps none quite like this one." Evelyn smiled softly. "They all have their quirks. But this house does feel different, like it's waiting for something." He looked down at his tea, thoughtful. Or someone. For a long moment they sat in silence, each sipping quietly. Then, almost as if unburdening something long held inside, he spoke. This house wasn't always so quiet. There was music once, laughter, dinners with friends, birthdays and arguments and piano lessons. Now it's all echoes. Evelyn listened, sensing he needed no reply yet, just someone to hear the words aloud. "My daughter, Grace, was a dancer," he said after a pause, voice softer. "Ballet. She trained in New York, traveled to Europe, even performed in Vienna. That music box upstairs, you found it, didn't you?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, it still plays." He smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes deepening. "She loved it as a child." spun it every night before bed, said it helped her dream. Evelyn felt the weight of his memories settle between them, not heavy but full of meaning. She sounds extraordinary. She was, he said simply, bright, stubborn, full of life. And then, life changed. He didn't say how, not yet. But the quiet in his voice hinted at a sadness too complex for a single afternoon. Evelyn reached for her cup again, wrapping her hands around its warmth. "I've raised 3 children on my own," she offered gently. "Sometimes life changes in ways we don't expect, and we carry it, even when no one sees." His eyes met hers, and in that gaze passed an unspoken recognition. 2 souls worn by time, both having known love, loss, and the ache of memory. They finished their tea without another word, but the silence had softened. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something shared. When Evelyn finally rose to begin her work, Mr. Whitmore stood too. "Would you mind starting in the parlor today?" he asked, almost shyly. "There's a portrait there I'd like to have dusted. Grace's favorite." "Of course," she said. As she stepped into the parlor, she noticed the way the light had shifted through the curtains. It fell directly on a painting above the fireplace, a young woman mid-dance, her form graceful, suspended in motion, as though caught between worlds. Evelyn approached it slowly, cloth in hand, and for a moment simply stood and admired the poise, the joy, and the unmistakable spirit captured in that painted stillness. She dusted the frame with reverence, careful not to rush, aware that this act was no longer just a task, but a kind of quiet ritual. She was not just cleaning a room now. She was tending to someone's story, someone's memory. And as she worked, she realized something else. Mr. Whitmore, for all his aloofness, was beginning to let her in, not just into his home, but into the spaces he had kept closed off, not out of pride, but out of grief. She didn't yet know where this would lead, or why the feeling in her chest tightened each time she looked at that dancer in the frame. But she knew she would return, not just because it was her job, but because something important was unfolding. The Whitmore house had secrets, yes, but it also had stories waiting to be told. And perhaps, just perhaps, Evelyn Carter was meant to help tell them. By the 4th week, the Whitmore estate no longer felt like just another house on Evelyn's list. Each time she parked beneath the sweeping oak tree at the edge of the circular drive, a strange anticipation stirred in her chest. It was as though the old house, with all its creaking floors and watchful shadows, had begun to welcome her, its silence less indifferent, its walls less closed. And Mr. Whitmore, still reserved, still wrapped in quiet sorrow, had started leaving the kettle boiling before she arrived. That morning, as sunlight streamed in through the tall foyer windows, Evelyn moved through the rooms with a practiced grace. Her fingers knew where the hidden dust gathered, where the furniture legs needed careful polishing, and where the light lingered longest on the wooden floorboards. But something tugged at her more persistently than the silver she had yet to polish, or the curtains she had meant to draw. It was that door again, the one at the far end of the upstairs hall, past the family photographs frozen in time. Each week she passed it. Each week it remained shut, not merely closed, but sealed with a silence that felt sacred. And each time she neared it, the air around her seemed to shift, heavy with the hush of stories untold. She told herself to leave it be. It wasn't her place. But that day, after she finished the parlor and kitchen and made her way to the upper floor, something about the way the light hit the brass knob made her pause longer than usual. It gleamed like an invitation. She reached out, almost without thinking, and gently laid her hand on the knob. It was warm. Not locked, she realized, just closed. Before she could turn it, a voice startled her. "That door," Mr. Whitmore said, softly from the other end of the hall, "hasn't been opened in 15 years. Evelyn turned quickly, guilt blooming in her chest. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." But he held up a hand, not in reprimand, but in understanding. "No need to apologize. You've been kind, respectful. Most people are curious. You've waited longer than most would." She lowered her hand and stepped back. Is it her room? He nodded slowly. Yes. Grace's, just as she left it the day she walked out. The hallway felt impossibly quiet in the space that followed his words. Evelyn waited, sensing he wasn't done. She was 23, he continued, voice distant. Brilliant, stubborn, determined to live life on her own terms. We argued, that day, about everything and nothing. I wanted her to stay. She needed to go. And I said things a father should never say. Evelyn's heart tightened. She thought of her own children, the late-night arguments, the slammed doors, the moments she wished she could rewind. She never came back? Evelyn asked gently. She wrote. Once or twice. Postcards from Paris, a letter from London. But then the silence began, and it's stretched ever since. He leaned on his cane, staring at the door like it was both a wound and a shrine. I kept the room as she left it. Couldn't bring myself to pack it away. It's silly, I suppose. It's not silly, Evelyn said, her voice firmer than she expected. It's love. He looked at her then, and something in his eyes gave way. Not tears exactly, but the shadow of them, the deep ache of memory that never quite softens with time. Would you? He asked after a moment. Mind helping me open it? Not today. Not yet, but soon, she nodded, honored by the trust behind the request. Whenever you're ready. That afternoon, as she cleaned the guest bedroom across the hall, Evelyn found herself glancing at the closed door again and again. Not with intrusion, but with a quiet reverence. It wasn't just a locked space anymore. It was a doorway to the truth. A turning point that had shaped not just Mr. Whitmore's life, but perhaps her own. She felt herself becoming part of something larger than the weekly cleaning visits. This house, this man, this unopened room, it was a tapestry of heartbreak and waiting, and she had stepped into its threads. Before leaving that day, she lingered in the foyer, unsure whether to say something or let silence hold. Mr. Whitmore approached her slowly and extended a small envelope. For you, he said. A little extra this week for listening. She hesitated. I don't need more. I'm just glad to help. He smiled faintly. Then consider it a thank you. Not just for cleaning, but for seeing. As she drove away, the house in her rearview mirror looked almost softer in the afternoon light. The windows no longer seemed like watchful eyes, but old souls peering out with longing. Evelyn gripped the wheel tighter, emotions stirring inside her she couldn't name. She thought of the door at the end of the hall, of the girl who left, and the father who waited, and she knew, with quiet certainty, that opening that room wasn't just about unlocking a door. It was about finding something both of them had lost. It was the following Thursday when Mr. Whitmore finally said, I think I'm ready. The words came over tea again, as they had begun to do each week. Evelyn had just finished dusting the bookshelves in the sitting room when he appeared in the doorway, leaning slightly heavier on his cane than usual. His voice was calm, but his fingers trembled just a little as he set his cup down on the saucer. Evelyn nodded without a word. They didn't need to say which door. She knew. Together they climbed the staircase, his pace slow but steady. The house was so still that their footsteps seemed to echo off the old wood, the hush growing deeper the closer they came to the door at the end of the hall. When they finally stopped in front of it, Mr. Whitmore let out a breath he might have been holding for 15 years. The brass knob, dulled with time, waited beneath his palm. For a long moment he just stood there, his hand hovering above it, not quite ready to turn. Evelyn stood beside him, silent, her presence a quiet support. Finally, he grasped the knob and twisted. The latch gave with a soft click, and the door creaked open on slow, protesting hinges. The air inside the room was thick with time, the kind that settled in layers over forgotten things. Dust particles danced in the sunlight that spilled through, gauzy curtains, illuminating a space frozen in a moment. Evelyn stepped in slowly, reverently, her eyes taking in every detail. It was a young woman's room, untouched since the day she left. A pale blue bedspread lay smooth over a twin bed, the corners tucked with precision, as though she meant to come back that evening. On the dresser, a collection of ballet programs leaned neatly against a mirror, their corners yellowed. Above them, photos were taped in a careful row, Grace on stage in mid-leap, smiling backstage with fellow dancers, and one with her father, younger, with more color in his cheeks and less weight in his eyes. There were shelves of books, novels, dance, theory, worn copies of poetry, and a small jewelry box with a broken clasp. Beside the window stood a full-length mirror, its surface covered in tiny sticky notes, curling at the edges. Evelyn leaned closer and read one aloud. "You are enough. Just dance." Another said, "Today is yours. Shine." Mr. Whitmore stepped inside last, moving as though through a dream. He looked around, his eyes scanning the room with the careful attention of someone seeing something both intimately familiar and impossibly distant. He ran his hand lightly over the back of the desk chair, then stopped at the edge of the bed. "She used to sit here every morning," he said quietly, "doing her stretches, drinking tea, reading Neruda." Evelyn said nothing, allowing him the space to remember without interruption. He walked slowly to the bookshelf and picked up a small framed photo. It was Grace, barefoot in a field, arms outstretched to the sky, laughter frozen on her face. He held it for a long moment, then carefully placed it back. "I thought keeping it all the same would keep her close," he murmured, but it only made the silence louder. Evelyn stepped to the corner of the room where a worn pair of ballet slippers hung from a nail. She reached out and touched the ribbons gently. "Maybe now that it's open again," she said softly, "the silence can shift." He looked at her then, something new in his expression. Relief, maybe, or the fragile beginning of healing. "You think so?" She nodded. Memories don't belong in locked rooms. They breathe better when shared. They spent nearly an hour inside the room, neither rushing nor lingering unnecessarily. It wasn't about cleaning now. It was about acknowledging. Evelyn dusted the window ledge and carefully wiped down the mirror, but left the sticky notes untouched. Some things, she thought, were meant to stay exactly where they were. Mr. Whitmore stood by the closet, not opening it, but resting his hand against the wood like it was a heartbeat he could still feel. When they finally stepped out and gently pulled the door closed again, it wasn't with finality, but with reverence. The room was no longer forgotten. It was part of the living house once more. Downstairs, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long golden rays through the sitting room windows. Evelyn gathered her things as Mr. Whitmore walked her to the door. "Thank you," he said, "for being here today." "You're welcome," she replied. "It was an honor." As she stepped outside, the wind stirred the jasmine vines again, and for the first time, the house behind her didn't seem weighed down by its past. It stood, with a little more light in its bones, as though the opening of that door had let more than just air inside. It had let in the first real breath in years. The next Thursday brought with it a rain that tapped gently on the roof of the Whitmore house, soft and steady like a memory returning. Evelyn arrived early, her umbrella dripping on the brick steps as she was greeted by the familiar creak of the front door. Mr. Whitmore was already in the sitting room, a blanket over his lap, a distant look in his eyes. They exchanged quiet smiles, no words necessary now to mark the deepening familiarity between them. Their shared understanding had settled like an old friendship, silent but certain. After her usual tasks downstairs, she made her way back up to Grace's room, this time with Mr. Whitmore's blessing. "Do what you feel needs doing," he'd told her gently. She would have liked you. The door opened easily now, and the room welcomed her like an old song half remembered. The air inside was less heavy, though it still carried the perfume of thyme, dust, rosewood, the faintest trace of lavender. Evelyn moved slowly, taking care not to disturb what didn't ask to be changed. As she polished the mirror, she read a few more sticky notes, small affirmations in Grace's neat handwriting. One said, "Find your stage." Another, "You're allowed to start again." It was while dusting the desk that Evelyn noticed the drawer, shallow, narrow, and tucked near the top. The handle resisted at first, but with a gentle tug, it slid open. revealing an old envelope yellowed with age. Her breath caught. The name on it was scrawled in youthful ink. Dad. No postage, no return address. Just that single word, like a hand reaching across time. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to touch it at all. But the letter had already called to her, and it was not hers to read. Carefully, she took it downstairs, where Mr. Whitmore sat staring at the rain. "There's something," she said softly, holding it out. He looked up, blinking once, then twice, and reached for the envelope with a hand that trembled more than before. The moment he saw the handwriting, the breath left him. He pressed the letter to his chest, eyes closing. Evelyn stepped back, giving him space, her heart thudding in the hush that fell between them. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he sat with it, holding it like something fragile and alive. Minutes passed, quiet and long, before he finally unfolded the paper inside. Evelyn looked away, but she could hear the slow rustle of paper, the thick silence wrapping around his shoulders. Then his voice, soft and uneven, reading aloud not to her, but to the house, to the empty air, and maybe to Grace herself. "Dear Dad," he began, his voice cracking on the first words. "I know you're angry with me. I was angry too, but I never stopped loving you. I needed to leave, not because I hated you, but because I needed to find myself. The pressure got so heavy, and I felt like I couldn't breathe under all the dreams you had for me. I wanted to dance, yes, but also to live. And sometimes I didn't know how to do both." He paused, his hands tightening on the paper. "I thought time would fix it. I thought I'd come back after a year or two, and things would be better, but I got scared of what I'd broken, of not being forgiven. I hope maybe one day you'll read this and know that I missed you. Every day, even if I couldn't come home." The last line shook in his voice, so faint Evelyn could barely hear it. "Love always, Grace." He sat in silence after that, the letter in his lap, his shoulders hunched as though the weight of forgiveness was too much to bear. Evelyn moved to the chair across from him and said nothing. She just sat, her presence steady and patient, letting him be small for a moment in the storm of memory. When he finally looked up, his eyes were rimmed with tears, but clearer than they'd been in all the weeks she'd known him. "She wrote this," he said, as though still not believing it. "She wrote it and left it behind. I never saw it, never looked in that drawer. All these years." Evelyn leaned forward. "You weren't ready then," she said gently. "Maybe now you are." He looked down at the letter, his thumb running softly over the edges, and nodded slowly. She was trying. Even then. The rain outside had grown heavier, but inside the house, something lighter had begun to rise, something close to peace. Mr. Whitmore folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of his cardigan, close to his heart. Then he looked at Evelyn and offered a smile that was small but real. "Would you stay for a little while?" he asked. "Just until the rain slows." Evelyn nodded. "Of course." She sat back in the chair as the storm drummed steadily on. The windows. No more words were needed. The house had spoken, the silence had broken, and for the first time in 15 years, the letter had reached the one it was meant for. It was a bright, breezy afternoon when the knock came. Evelyn had just finished vacuuming the front hallway, her ears still ringing faintly from the noise, when she heard it, a polite, almost uncertain knock, like someone wasn't sure whether to disturb the house at all. Mr. Whitmore was in the garden, or at least that's where she'd last seen him, slowly trimming the roses that had begun to bloom in spite of the lingering spring chill. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the front door. Standing there was a young woman, no more than 20, with auburn hair pulled into a loose braid and a nervous half-smile on her lips. She looked as though she'd practiced what to say 100 times and had forgotten all of it the second the door swung open. "Hi," the girl said, voice soft but clear. I'm sorry to bother you. I'm looking for a Mr. Whitmore. I think he might be my grandfather." Evelyn stared at her, heart thudding once, twice before it found rhythm again. The resemblance was subtle, but unmistakable. The shape of the jaw, the curve of the brow, and above all, the same eyes that Grace had in every photo. Evelyn stepped back, motioning her inside with a quiet urgency. "Come in," she said gently. "He's just in the garden. What did you say your name was?" The girl hesitated, hands twisting together. "I'm Lily Grace Harper." Evelyn felt a chill crawl across her arms. Grace. It was more than just a namesake. She led Lily to the back garden, where Mr. Whitmore knelt by the rose bushes, a pair of pruning shears in his weathered hands. He looked up as they approached, shielding his eyes from the sun. At first, there was no recognition, just the polite curiosity of a man interrupted at a task. But then he saw the girl fully, and the shears dropped from his hand into the grass. "Grace?" he whispered. "No, sir," Lily said, stepping forward slowly. "But she was my mother." The moment, stretched, taut and silent. A robin chirped from somewhere in the trees. Mr. Whitmore took a step forward, then another, until they stood just feet apart. His eyes searched her face like a man looking into a mirror warped by time. "She had a daughter," he murmured. "I never knew." "She told me about you," Lily said, her voice trembling but steady. "Not everything, just enough to know she missed you. She died when I was 11, cancer. It was quick. After that, I was raised by her friend, June. But a few weeks ago, I found something, a letter, from her, to me. She said if I ever needed to know where I came from, I should start with you." Mr. Whitmore sank slowly onto the bench by the roses, his face pale. Evelyn hovered at a respectful distance, hands clasped tightly, watching his chest rise and fall with effort. He looked up at Lily. She never came back. I waited. I was angry at first, but then just empty. Lily nodded. She wanted to. I know that now. She just didn't know how to fix what was broken. He blinked, the sunlight glinting off, the moisture in his eyes. "And you found your way here." "I had to try," she said. "I didn't come for money or pity. I just wanted to meet you, to know you." He stared at her for a long time, then reached out a hand that trembled with the weight of years. Lily took it gently, and for a moment they just sat like that, two strangers connected by blood and grief, and something more elusive, like hope, finding its way through cracks. Evelyn quietly retreated, giving them space. She went inside and busied herself in the kitchen, though her thoughts stayed out in the garden. When she finally returned an hour later, Lily and Mr. Whitmore were still talking. His posture had changed, straighter, lighter, as though something had been lifted from his shoulders. She heard fragments of conversation as she approached. Grace's love for dance, the small apartment they'd lived in, Lily's schooling, how she'd taken up painting instead of ballet. "Your mother would have loved that," Mr. Whitmore said, smiling softly. "She always said art was a way of breathing." Lily laughed. "She said that to me too." When she finally rose to leave, Evelyn offered her a ride back into town, but Mr. Whitmore insisted on walking her to the gate himself. They moved slowly, not out of age, but reverence, as though every step was a memory unfolding. At the gate, Lily paused and turned to him. "Can I come again?" His answer was immediate. "Please do. I've waited long enough." She leaned in and hugged him, a tentative, careful embrace that deepened as his arms came around her. Evelyn watched from the porch, her heart swelling at the sight. Something had changed in the house, in him, in everything. The silence that had once pressed so heavily against the walls had begun to dissolve, replaced by the echoes of conversation, laughter, possibility. That evening, Mr. Whitmore sat in the sitting room with the letter from Grace on his lap and a framed photo of Lily beside it. He looked at Evelyn as she prepared to leave and said, "You were the first one to open the door. You didn't even know what was behind it, but you opened it anyway." Evelyn smiled. Sometimes that's all it takes. Just someone willing to knock. And as she stepped out into the crisp evening air, she knew something had shifted forever, not just in that house, but in the lives it held within. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains in Mr. Whitmore's sitting room, casting delicate patterns on the worn oak floor. Evelyn stood at the counter in the kitchen, brewing coffee as the scent of cinnamon toast filled the air. It was Mr. Whitmore's 82nd birthday, and she had arrived early, as she always did on his special day, carrying a small paper-wrapped package tied with twine and a single white rose. But this year felt different. There was a quiet excitement in the air, not just from the decorations she'd carefully arranged the evening before, or the small chocolate cake waiting in the fridge. It was the promise of something new, something rekindled. It had been 3 weeks since Lily first knocked on their door, and since that day, she had returned again and again, each visit peeling back layers of silence and time like old wallpaper. Mr. Whitmore had transformed in ways Evelyn still couldn't fully believe. His shoulders no longer stooped in grief, his eyes brighter with every passing afternoon, his laugh returning like a bird that had been gone too long. Now, as he sat in his favorite chair, dressed in a crisp shirt Evelyn had ironed that morning, he looked at the clock more than once. She said noon. He muttered, not to anyone in particular, but Evelyn heard it as she brought him his coffee. "She'll be here," she said gently, setting the mug on the table beside him. "She hasn't missed a single Saturday since the day she found you." He gave a soft grunt, the kind that was half agreement and half disbelief. But the way his hand rested over the photo of Grace and Lily said more than words. Evelyn stepped outside for a moment to collect the mail, and when she returned, the front door was already open. Lily stood there, framed in the doorway, holding something behind her back and grinning like a child with a secret. "Happy birthday," she said, stepping forward to kiss her grandfather's cheek. "I brought you something." "I told you not to fuss," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "This isn't a fuss," Lily said. "It's a promise." She pulled a small canvas from behind her back and handed it to him. It was a painting, delicate brushstrokes, in shades of blue and gold, forming the image of a ballet dancer in mid-leap. But it wasn't just any dancer. It was Grace, young, vibrant, eyes alight with the same fire Evelyn had seen in the photo albums tucked away in Mr. Whitmore's drawer. He stared at the painting for a long time, silent. Then he touched the corner of the canvas like it was made of porcelain. "She's dancing again," he whispered. "You gave her back to me." Lily sat beside him. "I painted it from an old picture Mom kept in her journal. She always told me that one day, when I was ready, I'd understand what dancing meant to her, and now I do. It was her way of living. And this," she gestured around the room, "this is mine. You're part of it now." Evelyn watched them from the kitchen doorway, her heart full to bursting. She couldn't remember the last time she had seen Mr. Whitmore cry, but now the tears flowed freely, not from sorrow but from something richer. Acceptance, joy, love long deferred but never fully lost. The birthday lunch was simple: chicken salad on fresh rolls, iced tea, a slice of cake. They ate in the garden under the dogwood tree that was just beginning to bloom. Birds chirped, and the breeze carried laughter like music. At one point, Lily pulled a small notebook from her bag and slid it across the table. "I found this in Mom's things," she said. "It's mostly letters. To you. Ones she never sent." Mr. Whitmore picked up the book with trembling hands, thumbing through the worn pages. Each one was dated, each one written in a familiar slanted script. Evelyn glanced away, giving him the privacy of memory. Later, as the sun dipped low, Lily stood and stretched. "There's one more thing," she said. "It's kind of big." He raised an eyebrow. "Bigger than the painting?" "Well," she laughed. "Maybe not in size, but definitely in meaning. I'm moving to this town. I found a little studio not far from here. I got a job teaching art at the community center. It's not much, but it's enough." Mr. Whitmore blinked, slowly, stunned. "You're staying, if you'll have me," she said, only half joking. "I want to know you, really know you, and I want you to know me. Not just as Grace's daughter, but as myself. I think we still have time for that." He stood then, a bit unsteady, but strong in purpose. He took her hands in his and looked into her eyes. "That," he said, voice low and steady, "is the best gift I've ever received." As the sky turned shades of pink and lavender, Evelyn cleared the table, her movements slow, thoughtful. She felt as though she were witnessing a rebirth, not of a single person, but of a family. And it had all begun with a letter, a knock on the door, and a woman who cleaned houses for a living, but saw with the eyes of the heart. That night, as she left the house and walked to her car beneath a starlit sky, Evelyn glanced back at the front window, where the lamp still glowed warm and soft. Inside, Lily and her grandfather sat shoulder to shoulder, flipping through old photo albums and talking quietly. And Evelyn smiled, knowing this wasn't the end of anything. It was only the beginning. The morning after the birthday celebration carried a stillness that felt almost sacred. Evelyn arrived at Mr. Whitmore's house just past 8, as she always did, letting herself in quietly while the kettle hummed in the kitchen and the scent of old wood and rosewater hung in the air. The house, always tidy, now had a certain glow, as though happiness had begun to seep into its walls again. She hummed softly to herself as she began her usual routine, wiping down countertops and straightening cushions, the comforting rhythm of her work keeping time with her thoughts. But when she reached the small wooden desk tucked in the corner of the sitting room, the one Mr. Whitmore rarely touched, she paused. Something about it today felt different. The drawer, which usually sat closed and stiff from disuse, was slightly ajar, as if inviting her curiosity. For a long moment she hesitated, her hand hovering just inches away. Then, almost without thinking, she opened it. Inside, neatly placed and undisturbed, lay a cream-colored envelope, its edges yellowed with age. Her name was written across the front in delicate handwriting, Evelyn, with a steadiness that sent a chill down her spine. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting Mr. Whitmore to appear, but the house remained quiet. With trembling fingers, she picked up the envelope and turned it over. It was sealed, untouched, the wax flake on the back still perfectly intact. She held it to her chest for a moment, overwhelmed by a sudden wave of emotion, then carefully peeled it open. The letter inside was dated nearly 3 years ago. "Dear Evelyn," it began, and already her eyes filled with tears. "If you're reading this, it means I'm either too cowardly to say it in person, or I've already passed on. Either way, there are things I must tell you, things I should have said long ago but never found the right words for. You have been more than a housekeeper to me. You've been my friend, my anchor, my reminder that there is still light in the world, even when it feels unbearably dark. I know I've been difficult. I know I've shut you out more times than I can count. But you stayed. You stayed through my silence, my grief, and my stubbornness. You kept coming back with cinnamon toast and warm smiles and a strength I'll never understand. You cleaned my house, yes, but more importantly, you cleaned the dust from my soul. I want you to know that you've changed my life. And if by some miracle Lily ever finds her way to me, and I pray she does, I hope she sees you the way I do. A woman of extraordinary heart," the letter continued, each word a thread weaving into her heart, stitching years of quiet loyalty into something far deeper. At the bottom, in slightly shakier writing, he added, "There's a key taped to the back of this letter. It opens the trunk in the attic. What's inside belongs to you. Use it, keep it, burn it, whatever you choose. Just know it's given in gratitude and trust. Always, Henry Whitmore." Evelyn's hands trembled as she turned the letter over and, sure enough, found a small brass key carefully taped to the ringu back. Her breath caught. The attic. She had only been up there once years ago to help him sort through boxes, but he'd never allowed her to open the old trunk tucked in the far corner. Said it held memories too painful to disturb. And now, he was giving her the right to open it, to look, to know. She didn't go right away. Instead, she folded the letter gently, placed it back in its envelope, and slipped it into her apron pocket. She finished her cleaning slowly, with reverence, then made a pot of tea and sat with Mr. Whitmore in the garden. He looked better than she'd seen him in years, his cheeks pink with sun, his eyes alert and watchful as he told her a story about Lily's 3rd visit and the way she laughed just like her mother. But she said nothing of the letter. Not yet, not until she understood. That evening, after he had gone to bed and the house lay quiet, Evelyn climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, the key gripped tightly in her palm. Cobwebs danced in the corners, and the air was thick with the scent of time. The trunk sat exactly where she remembered it, its surface worn, the latch rusted but intact. She knelt before it, heart hammering, and slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. Inside, the first thing she saw was a stack of envelopes, each addressed in Grace's handwriting. Letters Henry had kept all these years. Beneath them were photographs, hundreds of them, faded but vivid in memory. Grace in her tutu at age 10. Grace in high school grinning beside a nervous-looking boyfriend. Grace holding baby Lily in a hospital gown. Evelyn's breath caught as she saw herself in a few photos too, quiet moments captured by someone who had noticed her more than she ever realized. Tucked beneath it all, wrapped in a silk scarf, was a small box. Inside, nestled in navy velvet, sat a brooch shaped like a dove in flight. It shimmered softly in the dim attic light, and she remembered seeing Grace wear it once, decades ago. There was a note beneath the brooch. For Evelyn, because you believed in peace even when I couldn't find it myself. Evelyn pressed the note to her lips, then closed the box, tears spilling down her cheeks. The trunk had not just been filled with memories. It had been filled with love, with things unsaid, with a kind of Grace she'd never expected to find. And in that moment, under the quiet watch of the rafters and stars, she knew her life had already changed forever. The next morning dawned with a softness that seemed to wrap the Whitmore house in a hush of calm. Evelyn moved through her chores more slowly than usual, the weight of what she had discovered in the attic lingering behind her eyes like a dream that refused to fade. Mr. Whitmore, though aging and frail, greeted her with an energy that surprised her. He was humming a tune she didn't recognize while stirring his tea, his smile gentle, almost boyish. She watched him from across the table, 1,000 thoughts circling in her mind, the letter in her apron pocket, the brooch now hidden safely in her bedroom drawer, the key that had unlocked so much more than a box. He didn't mention the envelope, nor the trunk, and she didn't bring it up either. There was a quiet understanding between them, one that didn't require words. Yet, beneath that silence, something had shifted. She could feel it. That afternoon, as she was wiping down the sunroom windows, Henry called her name. She turned, surprised to see him standing with a manila envelope in hand. His cane trembled slightly as he walked, but his eyes held purpose. "Evelyn," he said, his voice stronger than usual, "I need you to sit for a moment." She set the cloth aside and moved to the armchair, her hands folded in her lap, her heart thudding. He sat opposite her, breathing slowly, and placed the envelope between them. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," he said, "long before Lily came back. You know, when Grace died, I stopped believing in giving. I hoarded everything, my money, my time, even my kindness. But you gave so freely. You gave without asking anything in return. And now I want to give something back." Evelyn shook her head gently, smiling with that familiar humility. "You don't have to give me anything, Mr. Whitmore, truly. Your friendship has meant more than I could say." But he raised a hand. "No, Evelyn, please let me finish. This isn't about owing, it's about honoring." He slid the envelope closer to her. "This is not a check. There's no money in there. Not the kind you're thinking. But what's inside might just be worth more, at least to someone like you." Her fingers closed around the envelope cautiously. Inside, she found a thick document, pages of legal writing and signatures. At the top was a title that made her breath catch in her throat: Deed of Ownership, Transfer of Property. She blinked, unsure of what she was reading. "What is this?" she asked softly, her eyes wide. He leaned back with a tired sigh. "That little house on Maple Street," he said, nodding toward the window. "The one you pass every morning, on your walk here. It used to belong to my cousin. He passed years ago, left it to me. It's been empty for almost a decade. Needs repairs, but the bones are good. I've kept it out of nostalgia more than anything. But it's yours now. I've signed it over. Free and clear." Evelyn stared at him, too stunned to speak. The house. That quaint little cottage she had admired from afar for years, imagining what it would be like to have a space of her own, not just a rented room above the deli downtown. She had never dreamed it could be hers. "Mr. Whitmore," she whispered. I can't accept this. It's too much." But he smiled with that quiet knowing she had come to recognize. "It's not too much, it's just right. You've spent your life making other people's homes shine. Isn't it time you had one of your own?" She felt her throat tighten, tears gathering, the kind that rose up not just from gratitude, but from the deep ache of having been seen. Truly seen. He wasn't giving her charity. He was giving her dignity. Roots. A future. Later that evening, Evelyn walked to Maple Street alone, the deed clutched in her hand like a fragile treasure. The cottage sat beneath a canopy of old oaks, its porch sagging, paint chipped, but still lovely in a storybook sort of way. She stepped onto the porch and peeked through the window, already imagining the curtains she might sew, the garden she'd plant, the kettle she'd keep whistling on the stove. It wasn't just a house. It was hope made real. The air smelled of lilac and possibility. She leaned against the doorframe and whispered a thank you to the quiet sky. That night, lying in her small rented room for what might be one of the last times, Evelyn thought back to when she had first stepped into Henry Whitmore's grand house, just a woman with a mop and bucket, not knowing what was to come. Back then, she had never expected more from life than a few clean surfaces and polite smiles. But now she had a letter folded in her drawer that proved her worth, a brooch that held decades of meaning, and a house that stood waiting for her like an open hand. And more than that, she had a bond with a man whose heart had slowly unfurled, like a morning blossom in her care. In a world where so many things faded or broke, here was something rare. An enduring kindness passed back and forth like a quiet light between two souls. A gift beyond money. A gift of belonging. It was a Wednesday afternoon, warm and still, the kind of day when the air seemed to hush every sound, holding its breath in anticipation. Evelyn had just finished dusting the bookshelves in Mr. Whitmore's study and was carrying a small basket of linens toward the laundry room when the doorbell rang. It was a rare occurrence, hardly anyone ever visited. She paused, waiting to hear if Mr. Whitmore would answer, but when the second ring came, slow and deliberate, she wiped her hands on her apron and made her way to the front door. Standing there was a woman, her age perhaps in her late 40s, with sharp cheekbones, neat brown hair pulled into a low bun, and an expression that straddled both curiosity and caution. She wore a navy blue coat despite the heat and held a small leather handbag tight against her side. Evelyn opened the door slowly and offered a polite smile. "May I help you?" she asked. The woman glanced past her shoulder into the house. "I'm looking for Henry Whitmore," she said, her voice clipped and proper. "Is he in?" Evelyn hesitated a moment, the sudden visit catching her off guard. "Yes, he's in," she said. "May I ask who's calling?" The woman's gaze returned to Evelyn's face, eyes steady. "My name is Eleanor Price," she said. "I believe Mr. Whitmore knows exactly who I am." Evelyn couldn't place the name, but something about the woman's tone prickled her nerves. She nodded and stepped aside. "Please, come in. I'll—" "Let him know you're here." Eleanor stepped into the foyer, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. She looked around with an appraising eye, as if measuring the house against some memory or expectation. Evelyn moved swiftly down the hall and found Mr. Whitmore in his armchair, a book open on his lap. He looked up, startled to see her flustered. "Henry," she said softly, "there's a woman here. Says her name is Eleanor Price." For a brief second, she saw his face change. A flicker of something, recognition, maybe regret, passed over him before he set the book aside. "Eleanor," he murmured, almost under his breath. Good heavens. He rose slowly, straightened his back as best he could, and smoothed his sweater. "Please show her in, Evelyn." When Eleanor entered the study, there was no warm greeting, no embrace or handshake. Just two people standing across from each other, bound by something unseen and heavy. "It's been a long time," Eleanor said, her voice quieter now. Henry nodded. "Too long." Evelyn, unsure whether to stay or leave, lingered in the hallway just far enough to hear, but not to intrude. "Why are you here, Eleanor?" he asked. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I've come because of the will," she said, holding it out. "Because of the house. Because of what you left out." Evelyn felt her breath catch. The will, the house, her house. "I spoke to the lawyer," Eleanor continued. "He confirmed it. You gave away the Maple Street cottage. Just gave it away. To your housekeeper, of all people." Henry remained calm, his voice steady. "Evelyn is not just a housekeeper. She's more than that. She's been a companion, a caretaker, and a friend when no one else cared to be. She's earned more than you could understand." Eleanor's face tightened. "And what of family, Henry? What of your obligations?" He sighed. "I have very little family left, Eleanor. Lily is gone. Grace has been gone for years. You and we were cousins once close, yes, but you made your distance long ago." Her eyes flashed. "Distance doesn't dissolve blood." There was a pause, long and aching, until Henry said, "No, but absence can." Eleanor stepped back, folding the paper once more. "You should know. I'll be contesting it. The deed, the inheritance. All of it." From her place in the hallway, Evelyn's heart thundered. The house? Could it really be taken away, just like that? After all that had changed, after everything they'd been through? But she remained silent, waiting. "Do what you feel you must," Henry said finally, his voice low. "But know this. I gave Evelyn that house not as a handout, but as a legacy. She restored something in me that was lost long before Grace died. No court can measure that." Eleanor stared at him, her lips pressed tight. Then, without another word, she turned and strode past Evelyn, leaving the house with the same sharp click of heels with which she'd entered. Evelyn walked slowly into the study. Henry was seated again, looking exhausted, the book untouched on his lap. "I'm sorry," he said before she could speak. "I should have warned you she might come." "Who is she?" Evelyn asked gently. "My cousin," he replied, the last of the old family name. "We were close once, raised like siblings, but she never forgave me for what she saw as squandering the family fortune on Grace's care or on this house. She believes blood entitles her to everything." Evelyn sat down beside him, her hands trembling. "Will she win?" He looked at her, his eyes clearer than they had been in weeks. "No, I've had good counsel. The papers are binding. But she'll make noise. She'll try to rattle us." That night, Evelyn walked home with a strange weight in her chest. The cottage on Maple Street, which had felt like a dream come true, now hung in limbo. She had spent so long not daring to hope for anything that when it finally came, she wasn't prepared to defend it. But as she passed the cottage gate, she stopped, opened it, and walked up the path. The porch creaked beneath her feet, the key cool in her hand. She stepped inside and stood in the quiet, letting her breath settle. Whatever storm was coming, she would face it. This was her home now. Not just by paper, but by heart. The days that followed Eleanor's visit felt as if a storm cloud had settled over Evelyn's quiet life. Though the sky outside remained bright and blue, the weight in her chest didn't lift. Every time she walked past the mailbox, she half expected to find a crisp white envelope with a lawyer's insignia. She hadn't even spent a night in the Maple Street cottage yet, not really. It still felt like someone else's dream, like she might wake up and find it gone. She tried to keep busy, scrubbing and polishing and folding like she always had, but even Mr. Whitmore noticed the tremor in her hands and the furrow in her brow. On Friday morning, while she was making his tea, he cleared his throat gently and said, "She's filed it, Evelyn. The petition came through." She nodded slowly, her hands clutched tight around the teacup. "I figured," she whispered. "But we're not giving up," he continued, his voice firmer than it had been in months. We have a good attorney, a man I've known for years. He believes we have a strong case. But he warned me, it won't be pleasant. Eleanor has resources and she's stubborn. She'll dig up whatever she can to try and prove you manipulated me. That word, manipulated, hit Evelyn like a slap. Her breath caught in her throat. I never asked for anything, she said quietly, not even sure who she was defending herself to. Henry looked at her, his eyes tired but kind. I know that. And anyone who spent 5 minutes with you would know that too. But the court doesn't know your heart. They only know what's on paper. And on paper it looks like an old man gave away a house to his maid. That word stung too, maid. It didn't matter how many years she'd worked, how many quiet conversations they'd shared over tea, or how many birthdays and holidays she'd spent under his roof. To the world, she was still just the help. The lawyer, Mr. Benton, was a soft-spoken man with sharp eyes and a briefcase full of paperwork. He met with Evelyn and Henry in the study and asked Evelyn dozens of questions. When did she first start working? Had Henry ever hinted at giving her the house before Grace died? Did she ever discuss inheritance with him? Evelyn answered every question honestly, her voice trembling at times but never faltering. Benton nodded and took notes. They'll try to paint you as opportunistic, he said calmly. They'll say you preyed on a grieving widower, that you built trust for personal gain. Evelyn swallowed hard. And how do I prove that I didn't? Benton looked at her then, his expression softer. You don't have to prove a negative. You just have to be who you are. Your history, your conduct, your reputation, those are your defense. The first hearing was set for late June in the county courthouse. Evelyn had never been to court before in her life. The morning of the hearing, she stood in front of her bedroom mirror, smoothing the wrinkles out of her navy blue dress. She wore her mother's old locket, the one she'd kept since she was a child, the one that held a photo of her parents on their wedding day. Henry offered to drive her, but she took the bus, needing the quiet space to gather herself. When she arrived, he was already there, seated beside Mr. Benton, dressed in his best blazer, his cane in one hand. Eleanor sat across the aisle, flanked by a tall, stern-looking man in a dark suit. She didn't look at Evelyn. The proceedings were slow. Filled with legal language Evelyn barely understood. Eleanor's lawyer argued that Evelyn had unduly influenced Mr. Whitmore, citing her long employment, her presence in his daily life, and the suspicious nature of the will amendment. Mr. Benton countered with character witnesses, neighbors, shopkeepers, even the mailman, people who had seen Evelyn quietly caring for Henry and Grace for years without ever once mentioning anything about money or inheritance. Then Henry himself took the stand. Though his voice was frail, every word carried weight. Evelyn gave me back my dignity when I had none left, he said. She cleaned more than my home. She cleaned the dust off my memories. She didn't ask for the house. I gave it because it was the only way I knew how to say thank you. After court recess that day, Evelyn stepped out into the sunshine, the breeze warm against her face. She sat on a bench near the courthouse steps, her hands resting on her knees. Mr. Benton joined her, setting his briefcase down. You did well, he said. We can't know for sure how the judge will rule, but you made an impression. Evelyn looked up, her eyes tired. I just want it to be over. I don't care about the house as much as I care about what it's turning me into. Benton nodded. I understand. But remember, this isn't just about property. It's about your story, and stories matter in court. That night, Evelyn returned to the Maple Street cottage. She opened the door and walked through each room slowly. It still smelled faintly of fresh paint and lavender. She sat on the floor in the living room, her back against the wall, and let her thoughts wander. She thought of all the homes she had cleaned in her lifetime, how none of them had ever really been hers. She thought of Grace's gentle laugh, Henry's quiet strength, and even Eleanor's bitterness, rooted not in malice but in a lifetime of feeling overlooked. And for the first time in weeks, Evelyn allowed herself to cry, not out of fear but out of the deep, aching need to be seen as something more than what people assumed. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a battle for her future, for the life she had worked so hard to build, not through schemes or tricks, but through quiet, unshakable integrity. And whatever came next, she knew one thing: she wouldn't back down. The courthouse felt colder that morning, as if the walls themselves held their breath, waiting. Evelyn sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the locket around her neck rising and falling with each quiet breath. Henry was beside her, dressed neatly once again, though the lines on his face looked deeper, his posture slightly more stooped. Mr. Benton leaned forward, whispering that the judge had read through all the closing briefs and that they should have a ruling within the hour. Evelyn nodded but said nothing. She had hardly slept the night before, her mind tossing between memory and fear, between the warmth of what she had been given and the shadow that threatened to take it away. This was not just a hearing anymore. It was the final word, the one that would shape the rest of her life. When the judge entered the courtroom, everyone rose. His robe swished slightly as he settled into his chair, papers in hand, glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but firm, like someone who had seen too many lives unravel in this very room. In the matter of Eleanor Whitmore versus the estate of Henry Whitmore, he began, I have reviewed all submitted evidence and testimony. This case, though centered around a property, speaks more broadly to the question of trust, intention, and human dignity. Evelyn's breath caught. She barely heard the next words until they came to her clear and unmistakable. It is my judgment that the amended deed is valid. The property on Maple Street shall remain in the possession of Ms. Evelyn Carter. A hush fell over the room, like the exhale of a long-held breath. Evelyn stared forward, her heart thudding in her chest, not quite believing what she had just heard. Henry placed a gentle hand over hers, squeezing lightly. You're all right now, he said softly, a smile touching his lips. But Evelyn wasn't sure she was. Relief flooded her, yes, but it came tangled with sadness. She turned slowly and saw Eleanor, her face pale, her mouth drawn tight. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. There was no hatred there, just something hollow. Disappointment, maybe even regret. Then Eleanor stood and walked quickly out of the courtroom, her lawyer trailing behind her. Outside, the sun was shining. Birds chirped in the trees that lined the courthouse sidewalk. It should have felt like a victory march. But Evelyn moved, slowly, as if each step required her to accept that this chapter was truly ending. Henry walked beside her, leaning on his cane. You've earned it, he said gently. All of it. Don't ever let anyone make you believe otherwise. She nodded, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Thank you, Henry, for everything. For trusting me. He smiled, then looked off toward the trees, his voice turning distant. You know, Grace and I never had children for a reason. Not because we couldn't, but because she was afraid. Afraid of losing something she loved. Funny how in the end, we both found someone worth giving everything to. That afternoon, Henry asked Evelyn to return to the house on Hawthorne Lane. It was quiet inside, the ticking of the old grandfather clock marking time like it always had. He sat in his chair by the window, looking out across the street at the garden she used to tend. I think this will be my last spring here, he said. I've seen enough seasons. I'd like to rest somewhere simpler now. Evelyn's eyes stung, but she said nothing, just reached for his hand. He looked at her, his gaze clear. You've got a life ahead of you, Evelyn. A home, maybe even love. Don't waste it in grief or fear. Promise me that. She nodded, slowly, her voice thick with emotion. I promise. The days that followed were quiet and strange. Henry's health began to decline more rapidly than before. He moved less, spoke less, but always smiled when she visited. Evelyn brought him soup and sat with him in silence, reading from old books or just letting the sunlight fall between them. She watched the man who had once seemed so formidable grow thinner, his fingers trembling more each day. One morning she arrived to find the nurse waiting at the door. Her eyes were gentle. He asked for you, she said softly. Evelyn stepped into the room, and Henry turned his head toward her. His voice was barely above a whisper. Come sit, Evelyn. She did, taking his hand gently. He stared at her for a long time, then said, I want you to know, you didn't just clean my house. You cleaned my life. You made it mean something. Again. And if there's anything after this, I hope Grace meets you first. She'd be proud. Evelyn leaned down and kissed his forehead. I already miss you, she whispered. His eyes closed, his breath grew shallow, and then, just like that, he was gone. The funeral was simple, just the way he would have wanted. A few neighbors, the lawyer, a few old colleagues from the university. Evelyn sat in the front row wearing the same navy blue dress she had worn to court. As they lowered the casket, she dropped in a single magnolia bloom, just like the ones he used to admire every spring. Later, she returned to the Maple Street house and stood at the threshold, her fingers tracing the doorframe. It was hers now, not just by deed, but by memory, by love, by years of unseen labor that had finally come to light. As the evening sun bathed the front porch in gold, she sat on the swing Henry had insisted she keep. It creaked softly under her, swaying in the breeze. A quiet peace settled over her chest. She had fought for her place, had weathered doubt and accusation, and come out the other side not just with a house, but with a story that mattered. And though she had said goodbye, she knew some goodbyes were just doorways to new beginnings. Spring came early that year. The magnolia tree in front of Evelyn's new home bloomed brighter than it ever had, as if it too understood the quiet miracle that had unfolded over the past months. The breeze through the windows carried the scent of new grass, fresh paint, and something deeper, possibility. She had lived many years in the shadows of other people's homes, quietly polishing their surfaces, tucking herself between their routines and their resentments. But now, for the first time in her 60 years, she wasn't just passing through someone else's story. She was living her own. And though the house on Maple Street was old, with creaky floorboards and wallpaper from a bygone era, to Evelyn, it felt like a palace. It held echoes of Henry's laugh, of Grace's warmth she had never met but somehow felt, and of her own footprints, now rooted in every corner. But what came next would surprise even her. One morning, about 2 weeks after Henry's passing, Evelyn received a call from Mr. Benton. His voice was calm as always, but there was something in it, an undercurrent of surprise. "Evelyn," he said, "I think you'd better come by the office. There's something we need to discuss, something Henry left for you that didn't go through probate." Her heart skipped. She had thought everything had been handled, the house, the will, the court. What could possibly be left? But she agreed and arrived an hour later, dressed in the same beige cardigan she had worn on the first day she met Henry. Mr. Benton welcomed her in and gestured toward a chair, then opened a small safe behind his desk and pulled out a sealed manila envelope. It was addressed in Henry's handwriting. "To Evelyn Carter, to be opened after my passing, in her presence." Her fingers trembled slightly as Mr. Benton slid the contents out. Inside was a letter, yellowed with the faintest scent of cologne, and a second envelope. Benton cleared his throat and began to read aloud. "My dear Evelyn, if you're hearing this, it means I've gone to wherever Grace is waiting for me. I hope she didn't scold me for taking too long. By now, you'll know I left you the house, and I'm sure you've wrestled with whether you deserved it. But you did. You gave me something no one else had the patience or soul to give: companionship. Real, true, selfless companionship. That's something a man doesn't forget." He paused, then looked up. "There's more," he said, and continued reading. "But I also want to give you something else. Something Grace and I held on to for a long time, hoping to one day use it. We couldn't. Life got in the way, and then it slipped through our fingers. But maybe it's not too late for you. Enclosed is a key and an address. It's for a small cottage up in Vermont, nestled between the hills near Lake Champlain. We bought it on our 10th anniversary and dreamed of retiring there. We never made it. I want you to have it. Use it, visit it, or sell it. But know this: you have more than one home now. You have choices. You've earned the right to choose your life." Evelyn's eyes welled up as Mr. Benton handed her the second envelope. Inside was a small silver key and a deed, dated over 30 years ago, now transferred fully to her name. She blinked, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "Vermont?" she whispered. Mr. Benton smiled. "He never told me about this either. I only found it when going through the private safe in his personal file cabinet. It was tucked behind photos of Grace. He must have known he'd leave it to someone, and I believe he always intended that someone to be you." Driving back home, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in decades, a kind of giddy wonder. A flutter in her chest, like a child offered a new adventure. The Vermont cottage was only a dot on a map, a story Henry had never even told her. But now it was hers. And more than that, it was a gesture, a sign that what she had given was worth, something that couldn't be measured in hours or wages. It was love, gratitude, and the unexpected bloom of legacy. That night she sat on the porch swing with a cup of chamomile tea and stared up at the stars. She thought of Henry and Grace, of the quiet way life wraps people together across time, of the incredible unfolding of one act of kindness. She had only meant to clean a house, to earn her pay, to keep her dignity intact. Instead, she had been given the kind of riches no bank could hold. She took the key from her pocket and ran her fingers over the ridges. She wasn't sure yet if she'd move or simply visit. But it didn't matter, because for the first time in her life, she had options. She had not just a place to live, but a reason to dream. As the wind rustled through the trees and the porch light glowed golden around her, Evelyn smiled. Her story had been rewritten not by chance, but by kindness returned. And perhaps that was the most unbelievable gift of all. Not the house or the cottage, but the knowledge that she was seen, valued, and remembered. And as the night deepened, she whispered softly into the breeze, "Thank you, Henry. I'll take good care of both homes, and the memories in them." As the journey of Evelyn comes to a close, we're reminded of the quiet miracles that life sometimes holds, the unexpected gifts that show up when we least expect them, and the power of kindness that lingers long after a person is gone. Evelyn's story is a beautiful testament to the importance of love, gratitude, and finding your own path when the world seems uncertain. Thank you so much for joining us on this heartwarming journey. If you've enjoyed Evelyn's story and found inspiration in her journey, please take a moment to give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts, or perhaps even your own story. Let's continue this conversation together. Your stories matter, and we believe they can inspire others just as much as Evelyn's did. Once again, thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video. Remember, your kindness, your choices, and your journey are all part of something truly special. Keep believing in the unbelievable.